In this lecture, we're going to take a brief look at artificial neural networks. This is a very broad and deep field of research with lots of new activity, but we can only have a more superficial look at the basic ideas. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the perceptron, which tries to emulate or model a single neuron and is just a linear classifier. But then we're going to go back to that idea that we saw previously of doing nonlinear transformation to the data so that we can have better ability to separate the different classes. And we're going to look at how we can, using backpropagation, the backpropagation algorithm, train neural networks where a stack of neurons will now allow us to do consecutive nonlinear transformations so that at the end, if we are training a classifier, we can have much greater power to solve the problems that we want to solve. So that is the idea behind deep neural networks, and then just briefly we'll take a look at some applications of deep neural networks for bioinformatics. So let's start with this idea of the perceptron. The beginning of neural networks was with an attempt to model the neuron, and this even predates modern artificial intelligence. So in 1943 we have this first attempt to create a mathematical model of the biological neuron. So a neuron cell has these dendritic branches, which we can think of as where the cell feels, how it gets its input. And then there is this long axon and synaptic terminals where the cell will output a signal. And this cell operates non-linearly. So if the input, the stimulus that the cell is receiving is not sufficient, does not pass some threshold, then it dies here, does not propagate along the axon, and does not result in a release of neurotransmitters at the end. But if it's sufficiently large, then we have a wave of membrane depolarization that spreads through the axon and leads to then this neuron stimulating other cells at the end. So basically this is a nonlinear response that will not there will be no response if the stimulus is not sufficient. If the stimulus passes some threshold, then there is a spike of activation in this neuron, and then the neuron takes a bit of time to recover. So this can be modeled mathematically by considering the dendritic branches to be modeled by these weights which can multiply the different inputs. Let's say the input is a vector of numbers. Each number in this vector corresponds to a weight. That is a measure of the sensitivity of this hypothetical dendrite that would receive the input. Then we have this weighted sum of all the inputs, and we can use some activation function to check if there will be an output of 1 or 0 or something like that. So basically we have here some nonlinear function that will mimic this ability of the neuron to fire or not, depending on how strong the inputs are, or the stimulus to the neuron, or the inputs to this artificial mathematical neuron. So this led to this idea of the perceptron, which would be a way to automate the determination of the weights so that we get the results that we want. So basically the perceptron was able to learn by itself what the weights should be in order to improve performance at some task. And this was done in the late 1950s, and it was really something that people thought would solve the problem of artificial intelligence. So this paper in New York Times even said that it was expected that this computer would learn to see, write, be conscious, and so on. And it worked with a simple training rule, by which we have this linear combination of the inputs multiplied by some weights. So this part of the model of the neuron here, where the weight mimicking the sensitivity of the dendrites. And then if this passes some threshold, or we can use a constant here, a parameter that we can adjust and check if the total is above 0 or not. So if this is above 0, where this parameter here allows us to set the threshold, then the output of the perceptron is 1, otherwise the output is 0. And now what we need is a way of finding these parameters here, so adjusting everything here. And the training rule was to adjust each parameter by a small amount, where this small amount was a fraction of the error in the output multiplied by the input value that was passing through that parameter. So basically, if we go back here to the scheme, we input a vector of features that describe some example. We compute the weighted sum of these values, and we decide if the perceptron fires or not based on the total of this weighted sum. And then we compare the output of the perceptron with the actual class. For example, suppose we want to separate things into different categories. We have category 0, category 1, and if we present an example of category 0 and our perceptron fires with a 1, then this is a mistake. There is a difference between what the perceptron is predicting and the class of the example. So this is something that we saw when we were training logistic regression, for example, last week, and it's the same general idea. We want to improve, we want to adjust the parameters of the model to improve the performance in that particular task. So the rule here is if there is a mistake, then we take a fraction of the product of that mistake and the value of the corresponding input. So weights that are receiving larger inputs get a larger update, weights that are receiving smaller input get smaller updates, and now we adjust the weight by this small fraction. This value here is just a learning parameter, a learning rate parameter that is less than 1 and works in a way to help reach convergence, so not give steps that are very large, and slowly adjust the parameters so the perceptron will start performing better. And this was actually implemented. It was first implemented on an IBM 704 computer, so one of these big machines, but eventually it was implemented on an actual machine that used electric motors to adjust the potentiometers that were working as these weights, and the input was a camera that was had 20 pixels by 20 pixels, so the input was a vector of 400 values, where the researchers could present some simple images and indicate what the category should be, and the perceptron would learn to identify the correct category for the different images. So this actually worked and seemed very promising. The problem is that this perceptron is just a linear model. We can see here that we are taking a linear combination of the inputs. We do a nonlinear transformation here for the output, but we can only do this as a function of a linear combination of the inputs. So actually we have a linear model. We can only separate classes correctly if they are linearly separable in the space where the data is presented to us. So if we try to use a single perceptron, a single neuron, to separate something like this, for example, we are unable to get good results. So the inputs for this neuron are the two coordinates, the x, y here for these points, and we want the output to be 1 if it's red, 0 if it's blue, for example. But since this distinction, the output is only a function of a linear combination of the inputs, it can only make a separation between two regions of this plane that are separated by a straight line, which corresponds to that particular linear combination that we are learning. So if we have something that is more complex, is not linearly separable, we cannot use a single perceptron to help us solve the problem. So if we just use a single neuron, it doesn't work. And this, in fact, if we look at the mathematics here, if we use an activation function that is a sigmoid activation function, or the logistic function, then one neuron, this perceptron, is the same as a logistic regression. So remember that for logistic regression, we assumed that there was a function that gave us the probability of belonging to class 1, and we got the shape of that function, which is this linear combination of the inputs multiplied by the respective weights, and then pass through this nonlinear function here. So if we use a neuron with a sigmoid activation function, it's precisely this that we're doing. We are computing this weighted sum and then inserting that into this nonlinear function to get the activation of the neuron. So one neuron with a sigmoid activation function here works exactly the same way as a logistic regression. The training is slightly different because we are training, giving examples and gradually adjusting the weights of the neuron, but the model is the same. It's giving us the same class of hypotheses that we have with a logistic regression. So this was a big disappointment because they thought they had solved the problem of artificial intelligence and would have a machine that would learn to think and speak and so on. And in fact, it turned out to be equivalent to some generic linear models that were already well known in statistics. And so what the result here was that the realization that it was necessary to have networks of neurons and not just a single neuron in order to solve more complex problems. And this got stuck in this problem because with the perceptron update rule, we can train a single neuron, but we cannot extend this to a network of neurons. If we connect several neurons, then this update rule will no longer work, because now for many neurons we don't know what the target value should be. It depends also on the neurons in front and so on. So this was a problem. One single neuron is just a linear classifier. A network of neurons could go beyond this, but there was no way of training networks of neurons. So this was also fell into these 2 decades that are called the artificial intelligence winter, because there was a big disappointment with all the promises of artificial intelligence, either in logic systems, in the classic machine learning, and so on, and things were very stuck in this area at the time. But in the late 1980s, there was this application of backpropagation. The backpropagation algorithm had already appeared in other contexts, an analogous of this, but then it was discovered that this could be applied to train multi-layer networks. And so artificial neural networks got a fresh start from there, because now it was possible to actually train the networks in an efficient way. So to see the advantages of this, I'm going to go back to last week and see again what we can do when we have some linear model. So we have, for example, this logistic regression, or a single neuron, for example, that can gives us a linear discriminant to separate the classes. This can be the output of the neuron. It can be a logistic regression, but basically what we have here is we have a set of features from our data. In this case, the features are the coordinates of the points. We chose those particular features ourselves, and now we pass this to the linear classifier, and we can predict, based on the features of new examples, what the class would be. So this can be with logistic regression, minimizing the logistic loss like this. With a single neuron, we can minimize the logistic loss, or quadratic error, something like that. But basically, we are finding a hypothesis in this hypothesis class by adjusting these weights, so that we have a line that separates the two classes, and we have something like this. For points that are in this region of space, we output a low value, so a low probability of belonging to the red class, and then for points that are in this region of space, we output a high probability of belonging to the red class. As long as the frontier between the two can be drawn with a straight line, then this works well. The problem is that sometimes this doesn't happen. We don't have linearly separable classes in the space of the data that we are using, but we can solve this problem by those nonlinear transformations that we saw previously. So we saw that example with logistic regression where we do this by hand, but this of course is not very efficient, and you can use other classifiers that do this implicitly. Or in the case of artificial neural networks, we want the network to learn these transformations. But the idea is that as we do nonlinear transformations to the data, we are solving the problem of classifying the data in some transformation of the data, and this is the equivalent of doing a nonlinear separation in the original representation of the data if we now project everything back into the original space. So even though a single neuron is just a linear classifier, we could use it to solve problems, classification problems, where the classes are not linearly separable, if we could transform the data non-linearly before doing the classification. So if we could find some transformation that would solve that problem and make the data linearly separable, then we could use the neuron. Of course, if we have to do this by hand ourselves, then this is no better than any other model like logistic regression. The big advantage of a neural network is that we can get neurons in previous stacks, so in the first layers of the network, to learn the proper transformations, so that when the final layer looks at the data after all those transformations, it can solve the problem we want to solve. The trick here is that we need some way to train a network of neurons. With the update rule on the perceptron, we can only train a single neuron. Okay, so this is where backpropagation comes into play. The idea here is that we're going to propagate the effect of the error that we're getting on the output of our network to each of the parameters that we need to update, and use that information to know how to change the parameters. So if we have a single neuron, we have, after the activation function, an output value here. We know that what this value should be because we are training it with data that has already the desired labels. But now what we need to do is propagate that information of the error between the output and the desired value all the way through the activation function, this sum, and all the way to each of the weights that we have here. So we are propagating backwards this information in order to know how to change each of the weights to reduce the error that we're committing there. So one thing that we need here to do this backpropagation is basically we need to compute the derivative of the error function that we are measuring between the output and the target with respect to each of the parameters that we want to change, so that we know in which direction up or down the error will go as we change each weight up or down, and the proportion between the changes of the weight and the change in the error function. And to do that, we cannot use threshold functions like this, like we had in the perceptron. We need functions that have continuous derivatives. Or that we can at least compute the derivative everywhere and don't have these strange corners here where the derivative becomes infinite and things like that. So we can use, instead of this type of threshold function, we can use, for example, the sigmoid activation function. There are other functions that are more efficient, but this one is easy to understand because it's smooth like this, and we can compute the derivative everywhere without a problem. So to train a single neuron by backpropagation, let's suppose we have a simple error function, which is, for example, the quadratic error between the target class and the output. This is not a very good error function for classification, but it's simple enough so that we don't have many complicated expressions here, and it's easier to illustrate the idea. So let's suppose we have this quadratic error. This means that the output of the neuron, of the activation function of the neuron, the difference between that and the target value for this particular example, J, we take the difference and square that, and now we sum everything for all examples in our training set. So if we have n examples here, we are summing all of these to compute the quadratic error for the whole training set. Of course, we can also look only at the quadratic error of a single example or a small group of examples, and now it depends on how we schedule the training. I'm going to talk a bit about that. But the idea is that this would be our loss function, the square of the difference between what we are predicting and what we should be predicting. This is often divided by 2, so that when we take the derivative, this 2 cancels with that 2 there, and we have a simple expression like this. So this would be the derivative of the error function with respect to the output of our network. And now, if we chain these derivatives, we can go all the way to each individual weight in the neuron that we're trying to train. So we want the derivative of the error, for example J, with respect to weight I of our neuron. And what we need to do to get that is to chain all of these derivatives by multiplying them, the derivative of the error with respect to the output of the neuron, the derivative of the output of the activation function of the neuron with respect to that weighted sum that we feed into the activation function, and then the derivative of that weighted sum with respect to the weight that we are trying to update. So this is the error function for the example J. We compute the derivative for the output of the neuron with respect to the output of the neuron for that error function, and we get this. Then the derivative of the output of the neuron, which is the output of this activation function, with respect to the weighted sum of the inputs that we feed into this sigmoid activation function. So this is the derivative for this sigmoid function. And then we have the derivative of this weighted sum with respect to one particular weight, and this is just the input that is multiplying by the weight. So these are all the terms here that we must multiply, and we can chain these together and obtain the update rule for the weight of one parameter, which will be the derivative of the error function with respect to that weight, taken a negative sign so that we go down and minimize the error function, and this multiplied by this eta, by this small value that will make us take one small step at a time. And when we compute this derivative, so this is a chain of these 3 derivatives here, by multiplying them, we get this expression, which is the product of all the 3 derivatives, and this is the update rule for one single neuron. Basically, we have a target value, we have an activation function for the neuron, and we have an error function that is measuring the error between the activation and the target value. And now we are propagating backwards all these derivatives for the error function, the activation function, and then the product of the weight and the input, so that we can compute the derivative of the error function here with respect to this weight that we're trying to optimize. Okay, so this is for one neuron, and now we can train the neuron in this way, and neural networks are trained using stochastic gradient descent. This should be a C, not a G. That's a typo there. So the idea here is that when we present one example, we can compute the derivative with respect to each individual weight in our neuron for that particular example J, and this gives us a direction where we can go to slide down the surface of the error. So suppose we had 2 parameters in our neuron, a very simple neuron, and we would find out that going in this direction, when we have this particular example, it tells us to, so one example J, we start at that particular point, and this tells us that we can go down the error function going in this direction. So we take a small step in that direction, and this small step is given by this eta here. The size of the step will be determined by the eta. And then we choose another example. And now for that other example, we know that the error function will slide down in a slightly different direction, and we take another example, another step, and so on. So since the examples are chosen at random, we are doing stochastic gradient descent because we are doing gradient descent like we saw previously, but the actual trajectory here is randomized by the random choice of examples at each step. There, in fact, we can improve the efficiency of this, and usually neural networks are trained with batches of examples. And the idea is that we take a batch of examples, say 64 examples or 256, something like that. Usually it's a power of 2 to optimize memory use with parallel processors, but that's just a detail. But we take a batch of examples. We compute this expression for each example in the batch, and then we add all of these updates and take one single step corresponding to the sum of those updates. So it would be like we compute the sum of all these particular vectors, and then we change the weights of the network in one go. This is more efficient. It's still stochastic because we are choosing examples at random, but we are taking batches of examples, and we only need to change the network after each batch and not after each example. So it can help parallelization and improves the speed of training the network. Okay, so now using this we can train a single neuron. We see that as we pass through different epochs, one epoch is one pass through all the examples. So at this point, 200 epochs, it means that all the examples were presented to the neuron 200 times. But at each epoch, they are presented in a random order so that we avoid getting stuck while trying to find the minimum of the error function. And this starts improving the error and decreasing the error until eventually it starts leveling out, because a single neuron cannot adequately separate these classes in this data set. And so we have this residual error here that we cannot eliminate. But we can use backpropagation to train more than one layer, a network of neurons. And this is when you have a network where all the layers are connected, fully connected to the layers in front. We have this multilayer perceptron. And the idea is that we have one output layer. It can be composed of one neuron or more. And then we have several hidden layers, which are called hidden because we are not directly seeing the output of those neurons. And then we have the input, or the input layer is basically the input vector that we're going to feed into our network. So this would be an example of a network composed of 3 neurons, where we have 2 neurons in the hidden layer and 1 neuron in the output for classification. A multilayer perceptron is a network like this that feeds forwardly and where each layer is fully connected to the layer in front. So there are no missing connections here. So in this case, we have a fully connected network. All the layers are fully connected to the following layers. We have a feed-forward network because it's always feeding to the forward layers. There are no back loops here. Some networks can have that. We can have recurrent networks and more complicated architectures, but the multilayer perceptron is very straightforward like this. This is the input layer where we put the vector with the input values. The hidden layer is here. These are 2 neurons whose outputs are not directly observable by us. They are inside the network. And then these feed into the output layer, which is this single neuron that receives the output from those other 2. So now to train this, we can train we do the same thing. We pass an example here. We know the output of each of the neurons, and we know the target value at the output of the network. So we can train this last neuron in the same way that we saw for a single neuron. The thing is that the inputs into this neuron are not the actual values of the features of the example, but are the outputs of the hidden layer. But other than that, we can just chain the derivative of the error with respect to each weight that we're going to update by passing through the activation function, the weighted sum, and multiplying all these derivatives. So we have this value here, and we can we now multiply this by the inputs into the neuron. But note that now if we are computing this for neuron at layer M, then n, sorry, we then have to compute, or if we are computing this for a neuron at layer k, we don't use the inputs of the actual example, but we use the output of the activation function of the neuron at layer I. So basically, the values here, instead of being these x values which were for the input vector, we are now using the output of these previous neurons as the input into the last neuron. So we have here the output of the neurons in the previous layer. But we can compute this term, which is the chain of these derivatives for the neuron that we are currently working on, so this output neuron, and then multiply this by the input that is the output of the previous layer. And we can call this part here the delta for neuron n in layer k. And we can now compute the delta for each neuron at this layer. When we go back in the network, once we have this delta, we can keep chaining the derivatives. So suppose that we are trying to find how to adjust these weights, these parameters of this neuron here. We need to consider the error function between the output of the output neuron and the target value. And then we need to consider the derivative of the activation here, the derivative here of this weighted sum, and then the derivative of the activation of this neuron and the derivative of the weighted sum, and so on, until we reach the desired weights. So basically, we have to chain through the error function on the neuron in front, and going back through the activation, the weighted sum, and so on, and then through the activation of the current neuron in the hidden layer, all the way to the weight that we want to update. And if this neuron in the hidden layer is connected to more neurons in front, then we actually need to sum all the contributions coming from different neurons in front. So imagine that we have here, we are looking at this neuron, we want to update this weight, but we have several neurons in front here. So we need to sum this for all the neurons that we have in front, and then we need to multiply with this, with the derivatives with respect to here to the activation function and this weighted sum. But since these terms here are all computed here on the deltas and then multiplied by the respective weights, as we compute at the end for the last neuron and then go back to the one before last, so we computed this delta for the last neuron at the output layer, and now we can use the deltas at the output layers and multiply by these derivatives to compute the deltas in the hidden layer here, and we can keep going back computing the delta for each neuron and then using that to propagate the derivative information by keeping this chain of multiplications until we pass through the whole network and we know how to update all the individual weights. So basically the backpropagation algorithm works like this. Let's suppose that we have this simple multi-layer perceptron. All the layers are fully connected just to the layer in front. We will assume that we have a sigmoid activation and a simple quadratic error function. In practice, this can be a lot more diverse and complicated because you can have different loss functions, different activation functions, and so on. But let's assume this very simplified scenario. The first thing that we're going to do is to propagate the input forward through the layers. So we are going to, for example, with this layer, we present an example to the layer, and now we are going to compute the activation of these neurons here based on the input values and their weights and the activation function. And then we're going to keep going forward on the network to compute the activations of the next layer. And we do this for how many layers we have. So this, with this step, we're going to propagate forward the input and activate all the layers on the network. And now we have the activation at the output neurons. We can compute the error there, and we can compute the delta for the output neurons based on the derivatives of the error function and the activation function as we saw previously. And now we're going to do backpropagation. We have this value for the neuron on the output layer. We can go back to the neurons before that layer and propagate there by multiplying by the activations there and using the deltas in front. Note that this expression is for sigmoid activation and quadratic error. So this is actually the expression after computing the derivatives. If you have different activation functions and different loss functions, then the derivatives will have different expressions, but the idea is still the same. We're going to backpropagate by multiplying all those derivatives backwards along the network, and at each point we're going to find out how to update the weights at each particular step at each particular neuron in our network. So this will then be done after we compute all the deltas. We update all the weights with in all the neurons. For the first layer, the input is the actual input that we are feeding into the network. For all the layers inside the network, the input is actually the output of the previous layers. So note that the first layer of the network, this one, receives the actual values of the features of the example, but everything else in the network, all the other layers, are receiving as input the output of the previous layers. So we are chaining all of these transformations along the network. Okay, so for the general case, this is for this particular example, sigmoid activation, quadratic error, multilayer perceptron, but we can use backpropagation in the general case by propagating the inputs through the network to compute the activations, and then backpropagate the derivatives of the loss function. So as long as we can compare the output of the network to some target value and compute the loss function, and as long as we can compute the derivatives of all of the functions involved, we can now backpropagate this error by multiplying all of these derivatives and updating the weights. And this can be automatically generalized. There are systems of automatic differentiation by using functions for which we have the analytical expression of the derivative, and then just multiplying all the derivatives. So we can create different architectures with this, different activation functions, different loss functions for the neurons, add regularization terms, and so on. So one important aspect of artificial neural networks is that we have a very large flexibility for doing all of these different architectures and all of these different functions. So this is an example how this actually works in practice. We can train this network here to classify these sets of points, because in this case, what we are doing is we are feeding the coordinates of the points into the first hidden layer. And now these neurons will fire, and each one will fire differently because it will have different weights based on what it's learning during training, and it will create a different representation of the data. So these are the actual coordinates, the x and y coordinates of the points, and these are the activations of the two neurons in the hidden layer here. So one of the neurons is putting lots of blue points here to the left, and lots of red points to the right. Another neuron is putting some red points down and blue points up here on the vertical axis. But what happens is now this is becoming increasingly easier to separate with a straight line. And this is actually what the output neuron is seeing. The output neuron is seeing the representation created by the hidden layer, not the original data, but what these two neurons are doing to the data. So this is actually what the output neuron is seeing of the data as the network is trained. And it becomes increasingly easier for the output neuron to separate the two classes with a straight line. As we project all of these transformations back to the original space, which is what we are representing here, we can see that this network now can do a much better separation because it's a lot more powerful than just a single neuron. It's no longer just a linear classifier. And the good thing here is that we are not choosing ourselves what the transformation is, but the network is learning the best transformation in order to solve the problem. So everything is being learned here, not only the final classification, but also how to transform and extract the correct features. And we can extend this. This is a slightly more complex data set where we have the red points in the middle and the blue points around. But now we have additional layers that change the representation until the final layer is able to separate red from blue fairly well, because now it's only looking at the representation created by the previous layer, which in turn is a transformation of the representation created by this other hidden layer. So if we can stack these nonlinear transformations, and these are nonlinear transformations because all of these neurons have a nonlinear activation function. That part is important because without that it would just be a linear transformation overall. But since all of these transformations are nonlinear, we can stack them and increase the power to solve the problems that we want to solve. So this way we can build powerful models by stacking many neurons. There are other architectures, other details, but this is the general idea. We keep stacking networks, connecting them fully to each other, and then eventually we have something that is powerful enough to solve the problems that we want to solve. Of course, we have all of those problems of overfitting if we don't have adequate data and so on that we saw before. There are no free lunches here, but this gives us a very flexible, versatile approach to machine learning because all of these transformations are being learned by the network, and we can create different architectures as needed. Okay, so this brings us to deep learning and deep classifiers. Basically, a deep neural network is an artificial neural network that has many layers. There is no specific definition here, but once we stack a lot of layers, we have these deep neural networks. And they can be extremely powerful and nonlinear because they can combine many consecutive transformations, nonlinear transformations, and learn all of those transformations during training. So we can create different representations. And the idea here is that instead of being the user, the human, to try to figure out which features to use and how to transform the data, we can just feed the raw data into the network when training, and the network will learn the series of steps of nonlinear transformations until it can solve the problem by applying the final classification. That can be just the last neuron, which is a linear classifier. And we can see this is an example from convolutional networks that I'm not going to explain how they work, but basically they are used for dealing with images because they generate these feature maps. Also, if we have an input into dimensions, we can create these feature maps into dimensions, and it's easy to visualize what they are learning. So we can see that at the first layers, the network is learning to detect simple elements like horizontal edges, oblique edges, and things like that. And then when we go to deeper layers, we start finding more complex patterns like circles, curves, and so on. And then further into the network, we start looking at detectors for even more complex patterns, combinations of different shapes and such. So this effectively automates those steps of feature extraction, of transforming the data and putting it into some useful representation, because all of the layers are learning simultaneously how to do this in order to best solve the problem of minimizing the loss function. In bioinformatics, there is an increasing range of applications of deep neural networks. They are widely used for medicine, especially when dealing with image data or three-dimensional data, for example, in nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, CAT scans, things like that. Then using convolutional networks and deep convolutional networks is very effective in these cases. There have been lots of advances in structural bioinformatics using deep neural networks. So basically the best algorithms that we have now for predicting protein structure are deep neural networks. In the genetics and proteomics, trying to identify the function of genes, of proteins by the sequence of the protein, binding sites, and so on. All of this has been tackled with deep neural networks too. And in molecular interaction, trying to predict protein interactions for drug design and so on. So basically, wherever in bioinformatics we have an abundance of data, and especially if this data, it cannot be easily structured in tables, which is what you need for classical machine learning. So if it's unstructured data like images, sequences of values, data from measuring devices and so on, then in that case this becomes a very strong candidate for deep learning and for artificial neural networks, because these systems learn how to extract the correct features and convert the raw data into something that is useful. So we are not going to actually work with neural networks in code, because there is a significant overhead for using the libraries and implementing this. But you can play a bit with neural networks and get a feeling for these different layers, the activation functions, the transformations and such, if you go to Tensorflow Playground. So Tensorflow is an important library for deep learning. But there is this demo online. If you want to learn to use TensorFlow, there are lots of online tutorials, and you can use them easily with Python and the Anaconda installation that you have. You can install TensorFlow, but we are not going to cover that here, since that would require quite a few tutorials and lectures just to get started. But if you go to TensorFlow Playground, you can create your own network by selecting how many layers you want, how many neurons in each layer. You can select different data sets with different kinds of problems, different activation functions. You can try the sigmoid or rectified linear unit, for example. These are more efficient and more widely used today, but you can experiment with this and then set the network to training and see how the different neurons are learning different representations and contributing differently to these transformations until you finally can have the classification of your data. So to sum up, we looked at this first idea, the perceptron, and the idea of adjusting the weights of this mathematical model of the neuron by looking at the mistakes and nudging the weights so that they would minimize the number of mistakes. And this was the first approach. But the problem is that a single neuron is just a linear classifier, so it doesn't help us solve complex problems. But then we saw how backpropagation can be used to propagate the derivative information from the loss function all through the different parameters that we need to optimize in all the neurons on the networks. And now we can train neural networks. We can train stacks of neurons that are connected to each other. And this allows us to stack consecutive nonlinear transformations of the data that can be learned by the network, so that at the end, the last layer can solve the linear classification problem that we have. And so we saw briefly some applications of deep classifiers in bioinformatics.